I'd like to introduce David Curtis and Biddy Peppin, who are going to talk to us about their involvement in the history of two London arts laboratories that occurred in the 1960s and 70s, and David and Biddy are going to talk to us about those. David Curtis is a historian of film, a writer on film and a curator on film, and has also been very involved, very central to the organisation of the Film Study Collection at St Martin's. Biddy Peppin is an artist and an art historian and a teacher, and both Biddy and David have been involved in, well, were involved until their end, I think, in the London Arts Laboratories.
First of all, I'm just going to say a few things about what the Arts Labs seem to be about. And Dave will, of course, interrupt me or add things if I forget, which I'm quite likely to do. The Arts Labs were basically, well, they're called arts laboratories, and they were intended to be laboratories. And they were laboratories where experiment in all the arts could take place. And these were performing arts, theatre, music, and so on, poetry, film, and Dave ran the cinemas at both Arts Labs, and the visual arts, and I was one of two people involved in running the galleries. And the idea really of experimental work was that... How did that happen? No, it's gone off.
No, it's all right.
Okay. The idea of experiment really was to try and sort of create spaces where people could come and do things which they wouldn't be allowed to do anywhere else. Theatre productions that would sort of involve the audience in new ways, that were partly improvisatory, that used mime, that used dance. And films, similarly, that combined film and performance, films that sort of moved away from the traditional ideas of film and moved into areas of complete experiment. And works of visual art that were not like anything that anyone had seen before. And obviously, you know, a situation like that, on one hand, meant that there were quite likely to be quite a lot of failures, and there were. It also meant that people who were doing things or felt that they were doing things at the cutting edge could perhaps sort of, you know, communicate with each other at the Arts Lab, could do things together. And certainly the social aspect of the Arts Labs was very important. It meant that artists in there were places where artists in different media could meet each other and communicate and see what each other was doing. It also meant that artists could meet their audiences, because they were very, very informal setups, and audiences could meet each other. So there was this kind of social aspect to Arts Labs that sort of complemented the sort of radical cutting-edge experimentation that was supposed to be going on, and in fact often was, within the various areas. So that's what Arts Labs were trying to be. And let's move on to the next slide if I can remember how to do it. The London Arts Lab was initiated by Jim Haynes. This is a blow-up of a very, very small photograph from a newspaper, which is all we've got of him. And Jim was really the person who, well, he invented the term arts laboratory. And he started the first Arts Lab in Drury Lane. And he was the person who Jason asked to be here today, but he doesn't actually talk about the Arts Lab nowadays, and also he lives in Paris, so he suggested us as a kind of second best. Jim had come down to London having founded the Traverse Theatre in Edinburgh, which was a theatre club where theatrical experiment and performance experiments could take place. And he came down to London wanting to expand this concept into more of a sort of multi-art form space. But he was he who very much remained the Arts Lab, the Drury Lane Arts Lab's director. He had, as a person who worked very closely with, Jack Henry Moore, who was also a theatre person. And Jack and Jim were really the people who sort of ultimately made decisions, especially in the areas that they cared about most, which was sort of theatre and performance. And then there were other people, Dave doing the cinema, I doing the gallery, sorry, I've mentioned that already. And we were pretty much left on our own. We could do more or less what we liked. within those areas, provided, of course, that the most important aspect was to give access to people who needed to use the spaces and the facilities. So that's what we were doing. Now, funding, and this article from the Times is about Jim's fundraising. Jim was a very, very good fundraiser, and he was very good at sort of moving among people who had money and inspiring them and getting them interested and getting them to give money. And in fact, it was entirely through donations that he managed to secure a building in Drury Lane, 182 Drury Lanes, actually 3 buildings which were then knocked together, and within which a theatre space, a cinema space, and a large general space for moving around in and having exhibitions, plus a couple of additional rooms upstairs that were sometimes used for a restaurant, sometimes used for exhibitions, sometimes used by the London Filmmakers Co-op. So there were quite a lot of different spaces at the Arts Lab, but they were all entirely privately funded. The Arts Council didn't give money to that sort of thing, the GLC wasn't interested. So it was, Jim was really the person who made it happen financially, who secured the building that would provide the shelter for all these experimental works. And this, again, is a letter that Jim wrote to potential members. He says, I would like to extend honorary membership. Now, the Arts Labs were always clubs, and the main reason for this was that it meant that one was relatively free of censorship. And also, obviously, sort of membership subscriptions, which at the Arts Lab in Drury Lane was something like £1 a year, so it wasn't very ruinous. But the subscriptions did help to keep the places afloat. And this is a rather, I just put that on really to compliment it. It's a rather strange map because north is up here, but Drury Lane there. And that came out of a brochure that we did later. And this is where the map comes from. And sorry, this doesn't really, you can't really get very much from this. I'm just going to mention it. It's the only, I think, the only professionally designed piece of paper that ever emanated from the Arts Lab. And Jim had it done by a professional designer in 1968 as part of a fundraising exercise. So that was the reason for that. And this was the sort of thing we generally produced. And these are, and I'm sorry they're not very clear, but these are schedules. And we used to produce these generally once a week. The one on the left, I think, has a silkscreen heading, and the one on the right is entirely done by a wonderful process called a Gestetner, that nobody under 50 will know anything about Gestetners. It was a kind of machine for which you made stencils on a typewriter. I was, unfortunately, often the person who had to type them up. And if you made one mistake, you had to use a terrible pink stopping out fluid and retype it. And then it sort of went round. You could produce it. The Gestetner machine was actually hired at very advantageous rates from the Gestetner people. Jim managed to get it cheaply. And I think, I'm not quite sure about the one on the left, how it's reproduced, because photocopying in those days had hardly entered onto the scene. Certainly in the late 60s, photocopying wasn't really an option for anything. Anyway, these schedules list the different things that are happening that week in the theatre, in the gallery exhibitions, in the cinema, and so on. So that when people came to the Arts Lab, we could tell them what was happening this week and persuade them perhaps to come every night or every day. And, you know, to persuade them that they were going to get really good value for their membership. The theatre productions were very, very varied, and these, although the brochure that this comes from was professionally designed, the stuff that went into it was actually put there by the people who were working, so it's fairly accurate. And there were several theatre companies that were absolutely linked fundamentally with the Arts Lab, and one of these was the People Show, which had been founded by Jeff Nuttall, and was a varying group. I think there were generally 4 or 5 people in the group who had sort of partly scripted productions and partly improvised. And in a way it was kind of like an underground soap opera almost, because the same people were partly being themselves but dramatised projections of themselves. And they were interacting and putting themselves in different situations and exploring how these situations would sort of react back on them and their interactions. And so it was a very, it was an absolutely sort of addictive and absolutely fascinating series of productions, and as you could see there was listed 16, 17, and I think we got up to 21 at the Arts Lab before they moved. Another company that was very linked with the Arts Lab, but which didn't do very much, was Jack Henry Moore's Human Family. This was a group that was very loosely based on the Living Theatre in New York, and also partly on the Exploding Galaxy in London. And so they were a kind of, live together theatre group, but I can't remember much they actually did. And then Will Spohr's Mime Theatre from Amsterdam. They were at the lab a great deal, and they, were sort of worked in the lab in all sorts of ways. So, they were very, very often there. And then other groups, like the Brighton Combination, which was an arts lab that had been founded in Brighton, would come and perform as well. People like Totiliamco. And then there was one absolutely amazing production, which was that an actress who lived in a flat 2 doors down in Drury Lane, collaborated, I think, with the writer Jan Quackenbush to produce a sort of one-woman play, and the audiences went up to her flat and she performed and talked and sort of invented this persona for herself in her living room. That was absolutely brilliant. You were talking earlier about print workshops. Of course, at the Arts Lab we had to produce posters, and silkscreen was the method that we used, and silkscreen could be done fabulously easily. The one on the left, which is for the last people show at the Arts Lab, was done just using a paper stencil, a silkscreen and a squeegee, and that was all you needed. And in fact, it's not even proper silkscreen ink. It's powder paint mixed up with, what's that stuff? Polycell. So it couldn't actually be pasted up out of doors, but then most of the posters went to other people's notice boards in any case, so that was all right. And the one on the right, which was done by Will Spohr's partner, Ellen Eitzinger, was done using a stencil, an iron-on stencil. But anyway, these things could be just sort of produced as needed, and we didn't even have to have a print workshop to do them. You could do them on a table, which the earlier ones do. And later on, the table sort of became used for something else, and we used to do it on the floor. Things that went on at the Arts Lab, well, this... on the left you can see a poem by the New York black poet Ted Jones, which is about the Black Arts Week that we had at the Arts Lab. And Ted was at the lab a lot and wrote a lot of poems and performed some of them. And on the right there's I think it's Evening Standard account of a piano marathon by Richard Toop, who was a musician who was actually involved in the Exploding Galaxy, but who had a long time an ambition to perform Eric Satie's Vexations, a performance which took 24 hours. And so he did that at the lab, and Jim organised for a grand piano to be brought in, and he performed non-stop for 24 hours, and it was absolutely brilliant. And, had a big audience during the evening, and a smaller one through the night. But it was, certainly a very exciting thing to happen. The gallery is what I'm going to mostly talk about, because that was sort of what I was most involved with. I was very, very, very opposed at the time to sort of the keeping records. I wasn't interested in history. I mean, I know, I afterwards became an art historian, but at that time, the present and the future were what mattered. And so I made absolutely no attempt whatsoever to keep a record of the exhibitions that were held at the Arts Lab. The exhibitions were in this sort of multi-use space, which was, the social space. When people came into the Arts Lab, they would be greeted at a desk, and so that was in this multi-use space. And then at other times, well, at one stage there was a coffee bar in it, that I think wasn't for very long. Another time there was a bookshop. It was also the social space. It acted as a foyer for the theatre space and the cinema space. So there were lots of people milling around in this space. And exhibitions, really, there had to be a very quick turnover of exhibitions, because Arts Lab members came very often, and we wanted them not to see the same exhibition week after week. So exhibitions were generally 1 or 2 weeks in length, and I think there must have been 30 or 40 during the first year, some of them upstairs as well. So I can't really remember what most of them were. And, but this was a list created at the time, and some of them were exhibitions that we had actually had, and others were exhibitions that we had hoped to have but never actually did. The slides that you're going to see, and the images you're going to see, are really very poor quality. Some of them are taken from slides that are faded, and others are taken from very small photographs. And they're just, what there happens to be. We wrote to, we being Pam Zoline and I, Pam was involved in the gallery as well, we wrote to art schools. So here's a letter: "Dear Student Secretary, please put this up where it can be seen." We had all been at a particularly, I think, repressive and certainly particularly conservative art school, and so we thought that the opportunity to exhibit and do something new in somewhere like the Arts Lab would appeal to students who might be suffering under similarly oppressive regimes. And the only reply we actually got from an art school was from a group of students who I think were from Hornsey, though I'm not actually completely sure about that. Well, I always remembered it as St Martin's.
It says Hornsey on
That doesn't, Dave?
it does on the back.
Oh, right. Well, then that's fine. So they were from Hornsey, which was actually, where they would have been stimulated. It was not a terribly successful exhibition. I mean, they had come to the Arts Lab and thought very seriously about the space and thought that they would like to do something that would sort of very much involve the audience and the people who were passing through all the time. And so they set up their exhibition like a supermarket. Supermarkets were very new and rather exciting places in those days, I should hasten to add. They weren't, like Tesco or anything. And then on the shelves of the supermarket, they put all sorts of things made out of plaster of Paris that they had created. But it was a bit of a confusing show because people were not sure actually whether they were supposed to buy these plaster of Paris objects or not, and in fact they weren't. So I think it was sort of not entirely thought through, but it was a nice idea in some ways. I also put an advertisement in International Times, and I mentioned that photocopying sort of was hardly there. In fact, this was the first photocopy I'd ever done. So you could see it's a sort of photocopied mop, which must have seemed very new and radical at that moment, with Letraset on top of it. And it explains that there is this space and that we wanted suggestions for things to do in it. And we had one reply, which is the one on the left, sorry, the one on the right, which is from Roloff Lowe, an artist who had this brilliant idea of creating a pyramid of oranges, and the pyramid was probably about 3 or 4 feet high, and everyone coming into the lab could take an orange. And then in the back part of the gallery he put a large cone, similar height, or perhaps even higher, of gravel, which was rather less well received. And actually this exhibition was recently recreated by Roloff at Karsten Schubert. So there we go. An exhibition that I enjoyed particularly was by Jeff Nuttall, who I've already mentioned in connection with the People Show. And this was a wonderful exhibition made out of old bits and pieces, old clothes with stuffing, prosthetic limbs, clothes horses, milk bottles, paint. I don't know who the people are, by the way, standing behind. Definitely not Jeff Nuttall. Possibly just passers by. Or perhaps the guy in the green shirt is an Arts Labby kind of person, and the other two are just passers-by. I'm not sure. But anyway, what Jeff seemed to be doing was trying to sort of reinvent the human body from the inside out. And so, everything was sort of suggestive of internal organs and sort of medical interventions. And it was really a very, very, very powerful exhibition, and I think we actually had it on for 2 weeks. On the wall behind the final one, I should have mentioned that there wasn't much light in the Arts Lab, so we took all the works out onto the pavement to photograph them. Except for, in this case, we've photographed, it's the same piece in both images. And on the wall, you can see posters from Paris. And this exhibition was in June '68. In May '68, there was all those incredible rebellions by French students and the incredible poster making. And somebody came to the Arts Lab with a whole bunch of French posters, and so of course we immediately put them up. And actually the French example spawned, you know, sort of a whole generation of poster makers, silkscreen poster makers in London. And these are two. I put FAC up at the top, but I'm not really sure if they're FAC up posters, and I don't know who designed them. FAC up was an organisation with the, called Friends of the Arts Council Operative, which was started by Sue Braden, who had started pavilions in the parks, and by Joss Tilson. And it was trying to get the Arts Council to take on board some of the new things that were happening in the arts, instead of just, you know, sort of providing £1.5 million to Covent Garden. So I particularly like that one on the left, Covent Garden, £1.5 million, 150 arts labs at 10,000 each. And of course, you know, the arts labs, I mean, eventually the Arts Council, to be fair, did set up the new activities committee, but not until long after the arts labs were over. This was the nearest we came to a commercial exhibition at Drury Lane, and it was organised by Jim, who had made contact, or perhaps, I think it's the other way around, a guy called Jeremy Fry, who was a kind of socialite, and sort of got in contact with Jim because he had produced a multiple by the Greek artist Takis, and it was called Signals, and it was a sort of light on the end of a stalk that flashed on and off, and the idea was that you would buy, you know, quite a lot of them and have them flashing different colours in your house. The woman standing beside is one of the people who worked a lot at the Arts Lab down in Broadway, and certainly gives a scale of these things, which filled the lab for about a week. And I don't know whether any of them was actually sold, but it probably got Jeremy Fry a bit of publicity, can't really remember. Now, the bottom of this slide is missing for some reason, which is a real shame, because, well, the exhibition very briefly was by a Swedish artist who painted pictures of heaters on canvas, which he then stapled to the wall, the unstretched canvas, and so that the sort of, you know, the painting looked like a continuation of the wall. But down at the bottom, where you can't see it, there's actually a bit of a rolled-up mattress, and that's significant because you know, as I mentioned, the Arts Lab Gallery was a multi-use space, and one of the things that it was quite often used for was people sleeping, and they didn't always very quickly sort of, you know, take away their bedding after they left. And this led to one of the fact that it was always rather messy led to, I think, probably our greatest failure. Yoko Ono came in, and I'll tell you this story very quickly. And said that John Lennon had made a piece of art that he felt very strongly about and would like to exhibit, but he would like to exhibit it anonymously, and would we do it, please? And we said, oh yes, of course, we were absolutely delighted. And then we said, what's it like? And she said, oh no, I can't tell you what it's like in advance, but you will show it, won't you? And so we arranged a day when it was going to be brought round, and I went round that day, and it had already arrived very early. And what it was a piece of a broken drawer, three sides of a drawer with not much of its bottom in place. And we had a real problem because we didn't have things like exhibition stands. And of course things like bits of broken drawer were what we were normally trying to sweep out of the Arts Lab floor in any case. And we weren't allowed to label it or say who it was by, or even say that it was a work of art. So that was a real disappointment, and probably the least successful exhibition that we held in terms of audience response. Another exhibition that was, you know, by somebody who was quite well known but was quite happy to be identified was by John Latham. And John had this theory of flat time, and for him these roller blinds, which were mechanised and rolled up and down, were sort of exemplified flat time. Particularly an important aspect was that they were painted on both sides, and so as they rolled you would see the design on the other side of the blind, which was normally hidden, sort of just in a thin strip on the roller itself. And these were both hung on the wall and placed flat on the floor. You can see a bit of their electric wire there. And so in terms of the Arts Lab, it wasn't one of our best exhibitions because it rather restricted the space that people had to move around. But it was, I think, a very interesting show. Another show. Oh no! I'm sorry, I thought I'd had about 5. I'm going to hand over today.
I'm sorry.
Sorry about that. I'm really, really sorry about that, Dave. No.
Okay, well this was the cinema in the Arts Lab, which had a very low ceiling, and so we designed it to have a soft floor rather than seats. And this is an Italian magazine that was covering 60s London that made a feature of this. The space was interesting in the sense that it was unconventional. We ran a 6-day-a-week program there, Tuesdays being open screenings. And I suppose what we were trying to tap into was the rising interest in experimental film, artist film or whatever. There was incredibly little of that in existence at that time. There were, I think, maybe a dozen people working in Britain altogether, working with moving image who might have called themselves artists. They were only making works very, very intermittently. But there was this phenomenon concurrently in America, New American Cinema, with people like Andy Warhol, Stan Brakhage, Kenneth Anger and so on. And we were aware of them because they were being written about in magazines and so on. And I suppose my commitment, very much picking up on something that the Filmmakers Co-op was involved in, was to try and showcase all that work, show new work if one could, but also show a little bit of the history, because obviously people like Mayor Darren had been making films in the 40s, and before that Surrealists had been making films and so on. So this is a kind of weekly program, I think. This is from that yellow brochure saying some of the kind of things that we'd been able to show during our first year or so. Biddy would make these wonderful silk screen posters for work that turned up. We had to try and raise interest in what was coming that week. People very often just turned up with films, and we'd try and schedule them the week after, and we'd do a little poster like this and stick it up in a few places. One of the people that turned up was Michael Snow, who came with Wavelength, and this is a design that he made himself for the screenings of Wavelength in the Arts Lab. Again, we made money, and Biddy hasn't talked about money, but I mean we had very little money at the Arts Council, at the Arts Lab. The Arts Council would give us nothing, but we, Andy Warhol's Chelsea Girls turned up in its original version, 2-screen, 3.5-hour sort of random order program, and we played that, and that packed out the place. And the other program that occasionally would pack out the place was the kind of complete works to date of Kenneth Anger. And these, I say, are posters that Biddy made for those. A key person who arrived on the scene then was somebody actually who Biddy and I had both known at the Slade, where we studied painting, which was Malcolm McGrice. He was beginning to teach film within the painting course at St Martin's in the mid-60s, and I think he also taught at Goldsmiths briefly. But this was a show that we staged in the Arts Lab, which was both paintings and film, at the end of November, end of October in '68. Malcolm was a key person because he had joined in with others in the Filmmakers Co-op, founded in '66 in Better Books. Key person in that group, Bob Cobbing, the second from the right, the group on the left. The Filmmakers Co-op was committed to distributing any film that was given to it. You know, a really radical commitment, basically, to promote that work on an equal basis with all other work, and anyone could join. The catalogue on the right was his first catalogue, produced in '69, I think, with about 30 or 40 works in it, half of them English, half of them by visiting Americans who deposited things. But it was a kind of absolute beginnings of experimental film, artist film, as a real movement in Britain. And when Malcolm joined in, Malcolm Grice, he committed us all to, well, he recognised the importance of controlling the means of production. I mean, that's a Malcolmish phrase, but to control the means of production. I wonder what that's going on.
What's that, X?
I don't know. Anyway, he designed, well, he committed us to setting up a workshop for filmmaking within the Arts Lab, which became the Filmmakers Co-op workshop in due course. The drawing that you're not seeing on the left was for a film developing machine, which he actually built and installed in the Arts Lab. The one on the right was a kind of rather madcap idea that you could turn a Bolex 16mm camera into a film printer, so you could print your own film prints using that. He later rather more successfully turned a film projector into a film printer. There is Malcolm. And he also theorized the kind of relationship that should exist between production, exhibition, distribution, promotion, and all those things, and said they should all be controlled by the artist. It was a model developed by him for artists, but it actually became a kind of model for the political filmmaking workshops that developed during the 70s and into the 80s and became very, very important. In November '68, there was a kind of coup within the Arts Lab. Jim had kind of agreed unilaterally that Jack could determine all artistic decisions for a period of time, and the rest of us who were involved got very annoyed by that, and we kind of basically split off and set up the new Arts Lab. That's the old Arts Lab and its last phase. This was the new Arts Lab in Robert Street. Biddy included these three images as a kind of indication of the, in a way, schizophrenic state of mind that they had in that Arts Lab. And that, was it an institute for research in art and technology, which all sounded very grand? Was it a new Arts Lab? Was it simply a kind of, or IRAT as we abbreviated? What was its real function? And I don't know that that was ever totally resolved. This was the building. It was a much bigger building. It was given to us as a short lease building by Camden. It was about to be demolished. We had it for 2 years. But as you can see from that, we had, from the bottom, on the left-hand side, a cinema and gallery on the ground floor, a theatre on the first floor, the film co-op's film processing and editing suite on the third floor, video suite, which was a kind of innovation. This was John Hopkins with TVX, the first video lab in Britain. And then on the top floor, general admin and sort of metal and plastics, which was actually largely to do with building things for the theatre. This was the space before converted. This was the office on top of the wall between it and the conference room, half built. I don't know if it ever got finished. Here was one of our kind of weekly posters. Theatre posters. I'm rattling through all this because I'm running out of time. Gallery exhibitions. The interesting one on the left was one called Fun Fair, which was a sort of exhibition of light shows and sort of light performances by Carlos Sapochnik. And Ian Brakepool and John Hilliard's one on the right, which was a really important one, but I'm not going to talk, I haven't got time. This is a very influential one in terms of its history. That's the only image we have of it. Ballard's Crashed Cars exhibition, which he put together literally as an exhibition before he wrote the book, and long before Cronenberg made his wretched film. That incidentally is Sally Potter sitting there. She was the young filmmaker who was getting involved in the Arts Lab. Why she's holding up something saying £3,000, the cars were not for sale as far as I remember. But anyway, this was a kind of cinema program that I tried to do. With the co-op had been given a huge collection of American avant-garde work, which suddenly meant one was able to program in repertory a really interesting array of American avant-garde work, and of course there were, thanks to the co-op workshop, an increasing number of British filmmakers. So we ran again a 5-day-a-week program, always one day for open screenings where we would screen anything that somebody turned up with, but the rest was a kind of running history of international avant-garde, experimental, underground, we would call it then, work. These are schedules designed and printed by Biddy. One of the workshops that we had there, which didn't appear on that map, was a print workshop, which wasn't silkscreen. It was kind of early litho printing and gestetners and offset litho and so on. And so these were printed in-house. Again, we would do very short run flyers just to kind of give out, just doing a week's worth of program. Well, we skipped one there. Lonesome Cowboys was one of our big money spinners. We also showed kind of late night sci-fi movies and things, and Bike Boy, Andy Warhol's Bike Boy was another money spinner. It was a real skin of your teeth enterprise. We had no budgets we kept on applying to the Arts Council and getting turned down by them. They co-opted some of us onto the New Activities Committee to try and sort of prolong the agony, I think. But basically, we lived simply on the box office, and one of the problems with the second Arts Lab, I mean, it was a much more democratic structure, but in a sense we all, in our different departments, went off and did our own thing. And some of our own things were things like this. This was John Lifton, who was notionally in charge of the theatre, but he got much more interested in computers, and this was a wonderful multimedia event for Man and Machines by John Lifton, which was a kind of interactive early computer environment. The Computer Arts Society was set up around that time. People were getting involved in writing programs for whatever. This is London's first TV lab, Hoppy's TVX. Again, full of experiment, but almost no box office at all. I mean, there was no way that you could organise it. Occasionally, Hoppy would successfully kind of make an intervention into television. I mean, television was incredibly staid in those days and wasn't interested in what people might be doing experimentally. But Hoppy did persuade them on a couple of occasions. This was a kind of music video he made using his low-budget video. The core of his video collection was a Sony Portapack that John Lennon lent him. But this was, as I say, a music video that he did that went out on something called Disco 2 on BBC 2. But he also very famously documented a police raid, a drugs raid on the Arts Lab, and actually biked the tape that he did of it to late night lineup at the BBC, and they transmitted it that night, and that really made history in terms of the immediacy of video. There were key British moving image artists emerging that time. David Archer, his wonderful Mare's Tale was one of the first films we showed in the Robert Street Arts Lab. Peter Giddell turned up there and became a real key player in terms of the evolution of the arts of the film co-op. And Annabelle Nicholson down below, who was a student of Malcolm's at St Martin's, working more as a visual artist at that time, became really important in terms of artist moving image in the early 70s. And I include these in my last two images of multi-screen performances. That's Malcolm, Jill Everly, William Raven on the left. That was actually a performance they did in Gallery House in 1973. But the Arts Lab was, in a way, one of the places, I think, where that kind of what we call now expanded cinema, live performance cinema, installation film, was pioneered. Jeff Keane on the right showed actually long even before the first Arts Lab existed, but was doing twin screen things with Super 8. But I think in a way the Arts Lab was successful as a laboratory for video, for film, when it was at its best. Anyway, the lab closed in 1971. Some of the activities, the film co-op and the theatre, were temporarily rehoused in a new building called the Dairy in Prince of Wales Crescents. The Dairy had been taken over by Space Studios, which was kind of a new organisation at that time, creating spaces for artists to work in. But in a way, I mean, we all, I think, kind of just were exhausted at the end of that period, because it had really a very sort of full-on experience, I suppose, and we were so unsustained by public funding or anything else. But as I say, I think in a way we made a mark in the sense that the Arts Council did thereafter start funding more fringe activities. you know, performance art, photography, film. The film committee was set up in '72 or '73, and so on. So in a way, I think we kind of established probably that these marginal activities did have cultural worth of some sort. And some people who were important at that time have gone on being important artists ever since. So it was an interesting period. And there I'm going to stop.
Thank you.